friends, this is Ashley Latecki Ellenboss with Sky House Herb School and Apothecary, and today I'll be talking about red clover and its connection to women and gathering. So let's talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of this plant, and then we'll talk into that sacred female connection that it seems to have. So the plant's Latin name is Trifolium pratense. Trifolium refers to its pinnately shaped leaves. So it's a single leaf that's divided into three leaflets, and we're very used to seeing that out in the fields. And then pratense means of the fields. And so that's where it likes to grow, is in fields. The part that we use is the flower blossom. There are some people out there who use the leaves. I don't really use them in my practice, so I'm going to stick to talking about the blossoms. The energetics of this plant tends to be warming and a little bit moistening. However, as people might notice, when something warms the blood and helps the inner body detoxify, what often happens later on is this sort of after cooling effect. So it'll warm you initially, but then it will also help the body cool afterwards. So that's kind of an interesting fact about this plant. It's also moistening for many people. It helps them to hold and retain water. It may also make them more thirsty, and that might be partly because of some of the tannins that are a little bit astringent and drying in the plant. But it seems to overall have a general moistening effect, even though it might be a little bit mucosally drying in the mouth. All right, so now let's talk about its use as a women's gathering plant. So I wanted to bring this to you because it's something I've just found to be a wonderful connection of this plant. And with my students through the years, I've had so many of them have this similar effect and response to drinking this as a tea. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to bring up an image that I share with my students. This is an image of red clover blossom. So if you're listening to this, then you might not see it, but I'll do my best to describe. So on the left side of the screen is the flower blossom. On the right side of the screen is the full plant with its trifoliate leaves. So on the image on the left, I want you to notice the shape and the color of these individual little flowers. So this is actually a cluster of individual pea flowers. And I say pea because this plant is in the Fabaceae family, which is the same plant family as most of our legumes or beans, and also things like string beans and snap peas and all of those edibles. And they all have a very similar flower shape. The parts are what's called the banner, which is this top part here of the flower. It's kind of the largest petal that hangs overhead. Then there's the keel, which is the one kind of central bottom part. It almost kind of scoops up. So like the keel of a ship that steers it, it kind of scoops up like that underneath. And then on the side, there are two little petals that are called wings. So it has two wings, a keel on the bottom, and a banner almost kind of like covering it on the top. And for those of you who are familiar with the doctrine of signatures, which is the idea that sometimes plants can look like what they're used for medicinally, some of you might notice something very similar to the female genitalia when you look at these individual flowers. It almost looks like the labia, right? And then the hymen. And there's a bunch of them all clustered together in this round kind of orb. And to me, this image, it looks like a bunch of women kind of all gathering together. Everyone's making space for the other. There's plenty of space to shine and celebrate. Their wings are open. The banner is lifted. The keel is upright. So it's just this very kind of joyful exuberance that's being shared in all of these little labiate looking flowers all gathered together in a big round ball. And to me, when I drink this plant, I notice an uplifting effect, but also calming. It's kind of like when it's like a satisfying feeling that you have when you're where you need to be. It's like when everything is in order and your house is clean, the bed is made, you've got six girlfriends that you could call up at any time, or it could be any friends really, but there's people around you who have your back and you feel supported. You can just sort of relax a little bit, but it's a joyful place of relaxation. And that's what I think the energy of this plant really brings, is this community celebration and um, afterward relaxation. And so this plant is actually a little bit of a relaxant sedative. So it does have this little bit of relaxing energy to it, but it's really high in minerals, and steroidal saponins and isoflavones, which do a lot of different things, specifically in the female body. Now, certainly men can take this plant, and so can people that are identifying as female, because it will what it does is it will bind to those estrogen receptors, and that is really helpful if you have either, and this is the cool part, if you have either too much estrogen in your body or if you have not enough estrogen in your body. So if you're wanting more estrogen, this plant will activate those receptors, creating a weak estrogenic effect, which you wouldn't have had if, you know, those receptors would not have been stimulated without this little bit of input, which gives you a stronger estrogenic effect. The best part, though, is that if you have too much estrogen, which can happen and cause a lot of different issues, including some types of cancers, or fertility issues, is that these are weak estrogen binders. So they're going to plug and displace regular endogenous, or the estrogens that your body creates. And it's going to create a weaker effect than if that body made estrogen had plugged that receptor itself. So it's basically displacing it and creating a weaker response, which then modulates and modifies the estrogen levels overall in the body. So that's, I think, a pretty special thing that this plant can do. A lot of people ask me, I have a family history of estrogen dominant cancer in my family, or I maybe they've had estrogen dominant cancer in their body, and they wonder if they can take this plant. And so far, from what I've gathered from the research, is the answer is yes, because this plant also tends to have a stronger effect on the beta estrogen receptors. That's one of the things that it does. I'm going to stop my share here real quick. So what this plant does is it tends to have an affinity for the estrogen beta receptors. And these beta receptors are not the same as the ones that tend to be linked to estrogen dominant cancers. So the estrogen alpha receptors, these are the ones that tend to be more targeted. And there was a really interesting study that they did, I think it was in maybe 2002, where they took breast tissue samples from Western Americans, and then also from women in Japan. And they found that the women in Japan had less of these estrogen alpha receptors in their breast tissue and more of the estrogen beta receptors. And they hypothesized that because in Japan, women eat a very isoflavone or phytoestrogen rich diet, that over time their breast tissue has created more receptors for those particular ligands, or those particular phytoestrogen compounds. And so they have a much less lower risk for developing breast cancer. And then when they did the study on Western American women, they found that they had a higher predominance of estrogen alpha receptors, which makes them more predisposed. So the nice thing about both soy and red clover is that they tend to have a higher affinity towards those beta receptors, which still give the body that estrogenic effect without that higher likelihood of the cancer proliferation effect. The other thing that's kind of interesting too is that they found that um, that red clover specifically didn't increase cell proliferation, like in the breast tissue and also in the uterine tissue, but instead, it actually it it stimulated estrogen receptors in the endometrium without increasing cell proliferation. So I think that's important because one of the things we get so worried about with cancer is this proliferation, over proliferation of the cells. And so red clover doesn't seem to do that. It will increase it stimulates those receptors without increasing those cell proliferations. So I think that's pretty wonderful news. The other thing they did a study on the poor rabbits. I don't love when they do studies on animals, and it's interesting and helpful. So we'll just say a little prayer to those little rabbits. Thank you. And sorry. But what they found with menopausal rabbits was significant improvements in vaginal blood flow, bone density, and tissue integrity when administered red clover extract. So we can see that it does have, and there's been so many studies that have been done on different forms, like, teas, standardized extract. I think Promensal is one of the trademarked compounds that uses red clover specifically. It's like a specialized standardized extract, and they've done a ton of studies on them that have shown that yes, it tends to have that women overall who are peri and menopausal have a reduction of menopausal symptoms when they take red clover. Okay, so I was talking about the Doctrine of Signatures and the joyful women dancing together, and then I got sidetracked into science. So what else did I want to say about that? Oh yeah, I wanted to say that the image also looks a little bit kind of the Doctrine of Signatures again with the shape of things can be helpful. So let me pull that back up here. Share my screen. We've got this little picture here. So, you can see on the right side where you've got the whole plant, how they look kind of like little balls, right? They're these kind of rounded shapes. And so it kind of looks like it could be a tumor or it could be a mass, doesn't it? And red clover is one of the best herbs, and I've had great success in my practice using it for people who have had cysts or lipomas, any kind of cyst or fatty deposit. There's also been studies that have shown that it is anti-tumorigenic. So it also seems to have an effect on tumors that stops their proliferation and growth. So that's pretty amazing too. So it has that sort of like that tumor shape. And guess what it does? It increases blood flow, red, just like the color of its blossom, right? It's reddish pink color. So we know that from the Doctrine of Signatures, it's good for blood flow, and also breaking up cysts. So that's pretty, I think, quite amazing. Also, it has a cardioprotective activity as well. And you could also see this shape as being sort of heart-like, not the cartoon heart, but the actual organ of the heart. So the isoflavones found in this plant are anti-inflammatory. They activate a receptor line, which improves blood lipid profile. So it tends to increase HDL, which is what we want, and it decreases LDL, or those harmful low-density lipoproteins. And in a 2006 systematic review in women with a high BMI or body mass index higher than 25 kilograms per meter, they found that it did have this lipid balancing or lowering of the HDL. However, in women of a healthy BMI or healthy weight, it didn't seem to have that same lipid lowering effect. So there's something that this plant has to do with excess and modulation, right? There's something about too much or not enough that it seems to help with. And Maya Toll, who is, I don't think I have her book in my office, I think it's downstairs, but she has this great book called the Illustrated Herbiary, and you should check it out. Maiatoll is her name. And when she talks about red clover in this book, she says specifically it's about dysregulated energy, where you give too much until you're just exhausted and burned out, or you hold on and you don't give enough away until you become stagnant. So she also talks about this plant as being um, about regulating energy and regulating your output. And so I really do think that this plant does that. I think it really does help to regulate and balance things, but it does so in such a sweet and gentle way, a very, very gentle and nudging way. It's not kind of bang you over the head and make you go in any particular direction. So I think that heart, that study kind of is a good example of that, of how it works in the body, how it works to balance things when things are actually out of balance. What else can I say about this plant? Let's see here. I will stop my share again. And there's a few other things I wanted to say that you might find interesting. One is that this plant actually plugs opioid receptors. So it has opioid activity. Now, it's certainly not going to be the same as really, high opioid containing drugs like, um, what are they? Well, there's like heroin and, even California poppy has a little bit of opioid activity. I'm blanking on the name of the one that they give. Um, Methadone is one. And yeah, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So what this plant does is it tends to interact with those opioid receptors. It has a high binding affinity for mu and delta opioid receptors. And so what they think this is doing in the body, because not all opioid receptors have to do with like, that effect of numbing out and pain dispersion or relief. But some of what opioids do in the body is they regulate body temperature, mood, and also hormones. And so, one of the effects that this plant can have is it can have that temperature regulating activity in the body. And I talked about that before, why it's kind of warming in the beginning and then cooling in the end. But it also, I can't help but think about it as a nervine relaxant and just taking that edge off. You know what I'm talking about when you're just a little too tight, you're a little too wound up. You need to take a chill pill, as they used to say. I still say that, but so it's kind of like it gives you a very mild chill pill. It's a little bit of a sedative. You don't. One of my students asked, "Will this show up in a blood test? Like, will I test positive for opioids?" And no, you will not. It's a very, very low amount, but just enough to have some effect and some activity in the body. And then I think the last thing I wanted to say is about its effect on the skin and aging. They did a study where they took red clover standardized extract to 11% isoflavones, which is pretty common. I mean, I think that might be a little bit higher than how it is in nature. But what they found was that it reduced skin aging caused by estrogen deprivation. Because especially women, as we get older, estrogen is also responsible for collagen production and keeping the skin youthful and plump. And so a lot of women notice that when they go into perimenopause and menopause, that their skin elasticity changes quite dramatically. And so red clover can be something that's really helpful because of those phytoestrogens going in there, creating that weak estrogenic effect. It can have a youth enhancing effect in the skin. So I know for me, I'm always like curious. I'm like, what are things that I can do naturally to help take care of my skin and take care of my body? And I've been mixing together red clover and nettles, and that's been a favorite. That's my new favorite. It's delicious. So let me tell you how to make that, and then we'll end today. So what I like to do is take maybe like a quarter cup of those really fluffy red clover blossoms, and then about half a cup of dried nettles. And I'll put those in a quart-sized mason jar, fill it with hot water, like just boiled water, fill it all the way to the top. So it's a quart or about 4 cups. I cap it and I let it sit overnight about 8 hours. Sometimes I'll make it really, really early in the morning when I wake up at like 5:30, and then I'll let it steep until maybe about like 2 or 3, and then I'll drink it. But nettles is also very good for the skin. It's gently depurative or cleansing. It has a lot of vitamins and minerals, so it's very enriching and nourishing for the body. And then you add in a little bit of the red clover, and it also, nettles can be a little bit drying and a little bit warm, like heating. So I've found that mixing those together in this way really neutralizes the heating and cooling and the drying and moistening. So it just feels nourishing and good. But you can play with those ratios. There's no reason why you can't bring one up or the other down. Both of these plants are pretty safe to use in those moderate range doses. So I think that's all I've got for today. I hope that was helpful and maybe interesting. And perhaps next time you go out and you see red clover in a field, you'll just see all of these shiny, happy vulvas holding hands and bobbing together in the sunlight, and just thinking about your own community. And even if you identify as male, you can still take this cheerful plant in small doses, and just sort of get this warm, cheerful, supportive feeling inside, and it's really, really lovely. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you've used this plant before. Let me know, yeah, what you think of the taste, the flavor, if there's any other insights you saw in looking at the pictures, if you were able to see them today. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Take care.